Basic reinforcement schedules. This is a very important topic for aspiring RBTs. What is a ratio and interval is important to understand. Ratio actually means the number of times a behavior occurs, a set amount of responses. Whereas interval means a set amount of time. That means the duration for which we are focusing while we are setting our reinforcement schedules. In addition to ratio and interval, we have two variables which are very important, whether it is fixed or whether it is variable. When we say fixed, that means static. So whether it is ratio or interval. In fixed ratio, it can be FR1, FR3, FR5. That means FR1 means every occurrence of a behavior is reinforced. FR3 means every third occurrence of a behavior is reinforced. FR5 means every fifth occurrence of behavior is reinforced. That means when 5 times a child will do that behavior, we are going to reinforce it. Then what is interval? Interval can be FI1, FI3, FI5, or for that matter, any number. That means fixed interval 1, fixed interval 3, or fixed interval 5. What does that mean? That means that when a behavior occurs for 1 minute, we reinforce. When the behavior occurs for 3 minutes, we reinforce. When the behavior occurs for 5 minutes, we reinforced. So in a basic reinforcement schedule, when the focus is on time, it is called interval. When the focus is on the amount of responses, the number of responses, that is called ratio. Moving forward, then what is variable? What is variable ratio? That means an average amount of responses. How do we do that? So say for example, first trial we reinforced after 2 positive responses, and then after 4 responses, and finally after 3 responses. So what is the average? 2 plus 4 plus 3. That means 9. Divided by 3 trials, that means 3. So VR3 is an average of when we are reinforcing after the second, after the fourth, and after the third occurrence of a response. So that becomes variable ratio because the focus is on the number, on the amount of responses. The same way, when the focus is on the interval, that means when it is on the amount of time, it becomes variable interval. Say for example, VI3, VI2 and VI4. What happens? The average is 9 and that becomes VI3. So if 3 intervals are taken, 3 plus 2 plus 4 is 9 divided by 3, that makes it VI3. So an average amount of time talks about the basic reinforcement. So once as an RBT aspirant you understand the concept of ratio and interval and fixed and variable, success is bound to be there. So now let's try understanding each one of it in detail. Fixed ratio based on a certain number of responses. So reinforcement is delivered contingent on the responses. The number of responses that are required does not change until the schedule changes. Say for example, if we are reinforcing every second response, so after 2 correct responses, reinforcement. Next two correct responses, reinforcement. Another two correct responses, the reinforcement. So it's a fixed ratio. Ratio, remember, is the number of responses and has nothing to do with the time. So let's look at the question now. Which of the following represents a fixed ratio? A. Every 10 minutes you tell your son, good job. Now, what is the base here? 10 minutes. Minutes is time. Time is duration. Duration is interval. So, certainly, this is not the right answer. When we talk about fixed ratio, we don't talk about the interval, we don't talk about the duration. So, A is not the representation of fixed ratio. Let's move on to B. Sometimes my mail comes at 2 p.m. and sometimes it comes at 4 p.m. is again a symbol of time. Minutes, hours, p.m., a.m., everything represents interval. We are talking about fixed ratio. So even if I check my mail 100 times before 2 p.m., does not really assures that I have got a mail. So in this case, this is also not the representation of fixed ratio. So let's eliminate this. Let's move on to C. Each time the client labels correctly, you give them a token. Now let's look into it again with details. Each time the client labels correctly, that means we're talking about a correct response, you give them a token. Token is a reinforcement. So this is an example of FR1. FR1 means fixed ratio 1. Every time when the client does the right response, you are providing a token. So yes, C is the right representation of fixed ratio 1. D is none of the above, which certainly is not the option because we have already found our right answer, which is C. So always remember, certain number of responses only talked about fixed ratio, be it every, that is FR1, be it every other, which is FR2, be it FR3, which is the third response, but it is number, which is the base. So number of responses that requires, it does not change until the schedule changes by itself. Variable ratio based on an average number of responses. Reinforcement is delivered contingent on responses. The number of responses required is based on an average. For example, VR3, that stands for variable ratio 3, might deliver reinforcement on the second response, the fourth response, and the third response. And that is how 2 plus 4 plus 3 is 9. And as we are taking 3 trials, giving 3 responses, it is 9 divided by 3. So an average is 3. It is called variable ratio 3. So to keep in mind that this is the average number of responses. But how do variable ratio and fixed ratio schedule differ from each other? This is very important to understand because both are ratio schedules, but one is variable, which is the average, and one is the fixed, which is the static. So let's evaluate the following 4 options. Option A. One is based on responses and one is based on time. Is this right? Certainly not. Because yes, one is based on responses is the fixed ratio, but one is based on time is actually the interval. It is not the ratio. So first option is wrong. Moving on to the second option, B. One is based on a fixed number of responses, and one is based on an average, which is a perfect correct statement. Yes, in fixed ratio, it is based on fixed number of responses. So reinforcement is given after every fixed response. Say for example, fixed ratio FR3 means every third response is reinforced, and one is based on an average. As I already explained, that variable ratio is basically an average reinforcement. So second, fourth, and the third response, when reinforced, it becomes VR3. Moving on to the sixth, C, a fixed ratio is constantly changing. How can a fixed ratio change? Fixed ratio does not change. The last one, D, a variable ratio never changes. Again, is a wrong statement, because the minute it is variable, we are talking about a change. And that means we are depending on the average things. So we know out of A, B, C, and D, B is the right answer. Fixed interval based on fixed amount of time. Reinforcement is delivered contingent on the first response after a certain amount of time. The amount of time required never changes. So fixed means static, interval means time duration. Now, which of the following represent a fixed interval? Let's evaluate all the four options. A, you tell a client to complete 5 maths problems before break. So as we're talking about 5 maths problem, which certainly is fixed, but then it is the number, it is not the duration. Fixed interval means the time, the duration. So it is not the right option when we talk about A. Let's talk about B. You tell a client they have to sit in their chair quietly for 4 minutes. Yes, this is fixed interval. So you tell your client, as far as they sit in their chair for 4 minutes static, that's the way when you give the reinforcement. Fixed and interval. It's static, at the same time it's a duration, the time we are talking about. Let's evaluate the next two. C, you sometimes praise your client every 2 minutes and sometimes every 3 minutes. Now duration is there. That means it is an example of interval. But is it fixed? No, it is not, because sometimes it is 2 and sometimes it is 3. So on an average it is 2.5 or 2.5, which is a correct example for variable interval. Moving on to the next, which is D, none of the above. Of course, this is not right, because we know that B is the right answer. So fixed interval means that a behavior which is reinforced every defined static time, and it is called Fi. So Fi3 means that the behavior after every 3 minutes is reinforced. That makes it fixed interval, and it is based on the amount of time. Variable interval based on a variable amount of time. Reinforcement is delivered contingent on the first response after a certain amount of time. And when we talk about multiple durations, the amount of time required is actually based on an average. Let's take an example. Now, first scenario, if we are reinforcing the behavior after 2 minutes. In the second trial, we're reinforcing a behavior after 3 minutes. And in the third trial, we are reinforcing the behavior after 4 minutes. So this is the average amount of time. 2 plus 3 plus 4 makes it 9. And as we are considering 3 trials, 9 divided by 3 makes it 3. And VI3 means 3 trials like this. So every time, whether we are taking 3 trials or 5 trials or 10 trials, every trial amount of time after which there is a reinforcement is averaged out, and that is what is called variable intervals. Moving forward to the question, which of the following represents a variable interval? Four options. A. Reinforcement is delivered after 5 minutes. How can this be variable? When 8 is fixed, 5 minutes is fixed. So we are saying it is minutes, it is interval, but it is not a variable interval. Rather, it is an example of a fixed interval. Let's evaluate B. Reinforcement is delivered after 2 minutes, then 3 minutes, and then 2 minutes. Perfect example for a variable interval. And what will be VI? Now, VI in this case will be 2 plus 3 plus 2, which is 7 divided by 3. So that is how we calculate the variable intervals. So this is certainly an example of variable interval. Let us see C. Reinforcement is delivered after one response. After one response, that means it is a fixed and ratio. Fixed ratio example is where reinforcement is delivered after one response. And the last option is none of the above, which is also a wrong thing because B is our right choice. So variable interval is actually where the amount of time required is on the average. So let's try to put all the interval schedules in a nutshell. Fixed ratio, set amount of responses, variable ratio, average amount of responses, fixed interval, set amount of time, variable interval, average amount of time. Very, very straightforward. Continuous reinforcement versus intermittent reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is where every response is reinforced. So FR1, which is fixed ratio 1. So every time the child shows a behavior, the child is reinforced. This is called continuous reinforcement. But when we talk about the intermittent reinforcement, all other types of reinforcement schedules are intermittent. Can be any other schedule. It can be FR2. That means fixed ratio 2. In that case, every other response is reinforced. Or VR10, variable ratio 10, that every 10th response is reinforced. When we talk about FI3, that is fixed interval 3. Fixed interval means after every 3 minutes, when a behavior occurs for 3 minutes, it is reinforced. So reinforcement is given after every 3 minutes. And when we talk about the variable interval, that is, say, variable interval 10 or variable interval 2, in that case, we take the average out of that number of trials which are taken. That is what is called intermittent reinforcement. So we are very, very clear, straightforwardly, if you are an aspirant RBT, you must understand the basics of the reinforcement schedule, which is explained in this video.